No, well, thank you, and thanks to CSI for inviting us to be here. I very much appreciated the prior panel, which really brought home so much of the opportunity in services and digital trade. And I feel like we are now the doom and gloom panel, but fortunate about how national security concerns are going to impede those opportunities. But clearly, we have a very important set of topics to discuss over the next half hour. The good news is, well, we may talk doom and gloom. The happy hour is right after this, so you can cheer yourselves up before listening to Mr. Corman later over dinner. I'm joined by just a terrific panel to talk about some of the national security issues that are increasingly impacting digital services trade. And because there is a lot to cover and we are going to keep this to a half an hour, I'm going to dispense with lengthy introductions other than to say it's a real pleasure to be joined by Neena Shenai, now a partner at WilmerHale. Many of us knew her when she was at Medtronic and has a long and distinguished career on the Hill and around town. And then to Neena's left, we have Nigel Cory with the Information Technology and Innovation Forum, and then Emily Benson with CSIS. So let me jump right in to the first question. And Neena, I'd like to start with you. When I look out over the last year or two here in Washington, I see a lot of actions by the U.S. government, both the executive branch and to a degree Congress, with new regulations that are intended to address national security concerns, but also are having clear impacts on cross-border data flows and on digital services trade. We have an executive order on bulk data transfers. We have export controls around semiconductors and AI semiconductors. Just on Friday, we saw the Commerce Department ban the use of Kaspersky antivirus software here in the U.S. We have an ANPRM out on Chinese connected cars, just to name a few. We obviously the TikTok bill out of Congress. And of course, China is also taking lots of steps from its perspective to limit cross-border data flows and digital services in what it sees as an interest of privacy and national security. And so maybe just to throw a big opening question to you, when you're advising companies trying to comply with this emerging regulatory regime, what are you seeing as kind of the biggest risks and the hardest challenges that they're facing?
Well, thanks, Peter, and thanks to CSI for the invitation to be here. It's terrific to be here to join this expert panel and really be able to delve into some of the hot issues of the day. And I think the question you asked, Peter, is really at the heart of the intersection of international trade and national security these days, and how companies are dealing with this. And I think the biggest risks in this space for companies that do operate both in the U.S. and China globally are several-fold, because we're really living in this new world that you talked about. We've got increased geopolitical tensions, not only China, but think about the war in Ukraine, and the fact that really these tools that we have, these economic tools, have become the tools of choice short of boots on the ground. You have this increase of, when I think of it as sort of as a Venn diagram of overlap between national security and economic security. They're increasingly becoming more or less the same thing, and promoting free trade, open investment, not necessarily the orthodoxy of the day, even in areas like services, for example, where the U.S. has a comparative advantage. And then there's a leveraging of some of the existing frameworks, and Peter, as you mentioned, new frameworks to try to address these issues, and a proliferation of really highly complex new regulations. And we see this broadening of U.S. jurisdictional scope. That's in the case of even controlling traditionally non-controlled products, these EAR 99 products, as well as areas like the foreign direct product rule, which is going beyond and expanding, the scope of what enforcement authorities can be used by the U.S. government, as well as this broader enforcement interest. So when I'm advising companies, I'm wanting to put this all in this big picture context. And you've mentioned some of the major issues we've seen in this space, which are affecting cross-border services, data flows, and trade. And this list continues, and it's going to continue. And what they all have in common is that over time, rules have affected maybe certain industries. But I think what makes the new framework unique is that it's affecting everybody. And so if a company is involved in cross-border flows, but also traded goods, services, they're having to keep track of everything that's happening. And I think that is a major risk for companies. And secondly, to know their footprints and understand how these rules intersect with their businesses. And I think that, for folks internally, as Peter mentioned, I came recently from an in-house role. I think having those conversations with internal business folks about how these rules are affecting the business, how to mitigate those risks, especially since companies have built their businesses around the premise of free trade and open markets and open trade. So I think we're in a new world, and businesses are going to have to stay ahead of all of this very strategically.
No, thank you. Emily, let me turn to you for a moment and kind of open the aperture a little bit globally. It looks to me, when I sort of look at the last 18 months, 2 years, we have seen the U.S. government pretty aggressively use these tools. We've also simultaneously seen the U.S. government, at least to a degree, and argue about how much of a degree, but at least to a degree, step back from some of its traditional advocacy for international data flows and international tech rules, as we saw with the announcement last year about the change in U.S. position, or withdrawal of U.S. position for digital rules at WTO, and some other steps. Be interested in your views as the U.S. is doing more and more of these actions that are impacting cross-border data flows, digital trade. Where do you think the rules are being written, and where should they be written? And maybe if they're being written, if they should be written where they're not, how does the U.S. get in that room?
Well, thank you very much for the easy question. And I just want to start out by thanking CSI for the invitation to participate. I am very grateful to be here, especially with so many familiar faces. I was under the impression that Trade Prom was next month, but it looks like this is really the preview. I also know that we talk a lot about standard setting in the digital trade world, and I think we should really roll with a 30-minute panel as the new standard. Great idea. But on your question of where should we be making the digital rules, I think something tends to get lost in the conversation now, and that's that the US is in retreat, or that we're not really sufficiently engaging on the digital agenda. And I might analyze that question a little bit differently. And I would like to challenge the idea that there is one idea of digital. So you hear people say very frequently that we need to do more on digital, we need to re-engage on digital. IPEF isn't sufficiently strong on digital, but what does that really mean? I had a sort of revelatory moment actually in Paris and Brussels with a couple of people who were in the room in February, and this European Commission official said, look, the DSA is very simple. It's about taking what's illegal in the analog and making it illegal in the digital. And it's a very simple concept, but it's really this idea that real life is increasingly digital. It's just the mirror of the analog. And I think that's worth taking into account, because we're treating digital like it's some big thing that can be put into one box. But if you actually look at where a lot of the rules are coming from, it speaks to a much more diverse and variegated digital economy than I think we've traditionally appreciated. So of course, we've heard a lot today about the WTO JSI. We also have, of course, the G7 Hiroshima process on AI. That's very different. That's really intended to make sure that people who are designing large language models stress test it, that all of the stress testing is done in a very transparent manner, and that you cannot, for example, ask ChatGPT to provide the recipe for a chemical weapon. That's very reasonable. That's a very good standard to set in a G7-like framework. On the other hand, we have new arrangements coming out of groupings like the Summit for Democracy, where advanced democracies join together to decide to apply export controls on spyware or tools that can exfiltrate very sensitive data from personal devices. That's a very new type of regulatory regime that applies to something very pernicious in the digital economy. Of course, we have the OECD that's doing think tank style work on digital trade. A new I think more national security focused idea is the potential application of an architecture that looks like a non-proliferation agreement, but for advanced AI systems. So all of that means that it's probably worthwhile to pursue what the administration has been doing, which is a system of variable geometry, where you have different groupings for different objectives. And I think that's very worthwhile in this environment where there just isn't one shared objective. I think it's also a little bit misguided in some ways to think, well, we should just be pursuing totally free data transfers. Peter, you mentioned earlier the bulk data EO that came out earlier in the year. This is a very, I think, surgical tool that controls who can access sensitive data about Americans. And so all of this adds up into the need to, I think, create some sort of system where we're reducing the tension of this vacuum of one big system that's capable of promulgating all of the rules that would create the ultimate certainty, which will never exist. And then on the other hand, a system that's becoming increasingly, I think, oversaturated with too many initiatives, too many principled statements, too many small groupings that don't actually produce concrete, tangible benefits. And I think that'll require those two kind of disparate ends of the spectrum to meet in the middle. And for me, the G7 seems like a very workable place to start to actually set the agenda, knowing that that will have to trickle down through other groupings over time, and that each of the participating countries will, of course, have to take measures at the domestic level through their legislatures in order to make these measures binding, because we can't really afford to go through this national security digital environment without really enforceable rules.
No, thank you. And I do think it's been interesting just over the last couple of years, not just on AI and some of these issues, but kind of on export controls, on Russia, how the G7, which I think many of us, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago would have left for dead, has really kind of risen from the dead to become a major kind of multinational policy-making body again. Nigel, let me come to you next. I think it's fair to say you and ITIF have expressed some cautionary notes about a couple of the administration's actions. For example, one issue we hadn't brought up yet, they are working to impose KYC requirements, know your customer requirements on certain cloud services providers. This is Emily. Said there's a bulk data executive order and rulemaking process underway. But you have also talked about the importance of having kind of shared international standards around the concept the Japanese came up with some years ago about data free flow with trust. And so a question for you really sort of first, how would you grade what the administration has done? And then second, how would you recommend they go out and build some multinational support around a DFFT concept?
Easy questions. Firstly, thanks to Casey and Christine and CSI for hosting this today. Always a great forum. A grade, putting aside what USTR did, because that deserves its own separate grade. But I think from a national and economic security view, in trying to judge them on the nexus between what they've done on those issues and trade, I would perhaps give them a B plus. In judged for difficulty and complexity, given what they're dealing with is really quite new and they're dealing with it at speed. And these are highly complex issues where, I mean, Emily knows better than me, they're trying to apply concepts and concerns in and around export controls and foreign investment to new intangible services and data. And that's very difficult to do. And the point being, and you bring up the KYC requirement, which gets to Emily's point, they've got to be careful in how they do it, given the speed they're trying to do it, because some analog concepts like know your customer and suspicious transaction reports in a financial regulatory sense, which are normal and day-to-day, just don't translate and apply well into the digital space. And so the administration hopefully taking that feedback on board and then reconsidering what they're doing and trying to get at the underlying issue. But that gets to the point as the administration has been sprinting and chewing gum at the same time on these national and economic security issues, it needs to simultaneously sort of talk and work with its allies, because the nature of these concerns and these technologies are global. And so if the US wants them to be more effective, it needs to ensure that they're in alignment with key like-minded partners around the world. And as Emily was saying, like, there's really a global vacuum institutionally to deal with the range of complex digital issues, especially ones that involve national security. And so into that vacuum, I think, has stepped the Data Free Flow of Trust Initiative, DFFT. And I give the Japanese so much credit for putting it on the agenda for discussions year after year, where no other forum allows for like more pragmatic, targeted discussions there. I mean, there's no way that these types of discussions should take place at the United Nations. And so there aren't many other forums for them to get together where you can get trade, cybersecurity, privacy, and national security folks in the same room. And so DFFT is it. However, obviously, some people in this room and many others are skeptical of it because it's existed for nearly 5 odd years and has struggled to get runs on the board. But that's not to say the potential is still there, which I think it is, in that it's our best potential vehicle for progress on these issues, because it involves a small group of countries, which I think is a critical recipe for the variable geometry that Emily was talking about, that are generally on the same page on these issues, that already have runs on the board vis-a-vis Cloud Act agreements, the US-EU Data Privacy Framework, the OECD Trusted Access to Government Data Initiative and such, that they can actually make progress on these tough issues. The challenge now, again, as Emily was saying, is with this variable geometry, which the DFFT initiative sits within, is getting runs on the board. It was good recently to see that they've created a secretariat at the OECD to try and do that. I think the OECD is uniquely situated to do well with this because they cover all the issues and they have the technocratic, pragmatic type discussions. They can do AI, data privacy, and national security. And that's a rare combination for an international organization. And so, but the trick will be bringing it to life. And perhaps the challenge for the US is like to learn from what it has done thus far, to think about, well, what is it one on the agenda, and to learn from how it's done what it's done, to try and figure out, well, in the future, how can we use the DFFT to build cooperation with our partners?
Thanks. Emily, let me come back to you to pick up a little bit on what you said and a little bit on what Nigel said. And I think one of the things that if you talk to any company around the room, they might have concerns about an individual action of the U.S. That the U.S. has taken. But I think what really worries companies is kind of proliferation of standards, proliferation of actions that don't match by governments all over the world, and kind of fragmentation. Where do you think the U.S. government has been successful in getting some international alignment on a couple of these issues? When I look at it, semiconductor export controls looks like one, but some of the data issues, maybe not as much so far, but maybe you disagree. But where do you think there has been some alignment? And if you were looking over the next 12 to 24 months, where do you think we might see alignment?
Yeah, so I think I would go back to this comment about what's analog versus digital, and how digital is actually in a lot of ways very much like the analog. And Peter, you mentioned, of course, the export controls on advanced AI chips. One underappreciated aspect of this administration's foreign policy has been on internet pipelines, which is undersea cables. And I think it's kind of easy to say, well, the free digital environment, the digital economy that we've built now is directly a result of standards and principled statements. We've agreed to engage in a certain type of economic behavior. It really is in some ways a lot more of an architectural question that underpins the way the data actually flows. It's just like a pipeline. You can see these great pictures of Meta putting these tubes in the water off the coast of California. It's a very physical thing. And so I think the future of how we govern the internet will actually be a very a concrete one. If you look at what China is doing in the South China Sea, for example, they're essentially trying to build an internet that connects without US intervention or without US inputs. And so if you're looking at how to create certainty, how to create a pipeline that facilitates international exchange of data in a high trust environment among like-minded countries, a lot of that will require physical investment. And I think that's a great place, again, for the G7 to set a standard that really prioritizes a reassessment. And I know the G7 gets a lot of heat for putting out these extraordinarily long statements that some people think are full of superfluous content, but actually embedded in, for example, if you look at the Italy summit from 2 weeks ago, if you look at the global issues section, there's actually a lot of very rich content in there that can serve as a signaling device to your home government. And so the G7 can include these bits and pieces that say, hey, let's reprioritize the actual internet infrastructure, knowing that China is trying to outcompete us and create a parallel internet. And so I think we'll have a lot of luck if we make those concrete investments over time, but it will not necessarily look like a traditional standard. And that goes back to the original question of whether or not we're actually retreating or whether or not the homework has changed. And I think really the task at hand calls for a different approach, and that we're in a little bit of purgatory right now, but that with the right reassessment, and I do have to credit again this administration and also the previous administration for refocusing the national security agenda to convince both allies and partners and domestic firms that a reassessment is actually necessary. And that will be, I think, at the end of the day, the accelerant that we need to get out of purgatory and into something a little bit more durable.
Thanks. Neena, I want to come to you, and I want to actually pick up on a line that Emily just said about. She gave some credit to the previous administration and to the current administration. We are obviously a couple of months out from an election. And I think it's fair to say being tough on China is a popular topic by both candidates running in this election. You obviously have watched and participated in debates around town across numerous different phases of your career, including spending some time on the Hill working in Republican offices on the Hill. Be interested in hearing your views about how you think things might either change or not change, depending on the outcome of the elections in November.
Yeah, well, I think we're all trying to do this crystal ball gazing
Exactly.
these days. I would say, picking up on what Emily and Nigel have said, I think directionally, I think there are few things in Washington, very few things in Washington that bring folks together. And China is definitely it. And it's, I would say that things are very likely to get worse before they get better. So I think directionally, regardless of what happens in the election, I think this is only going to be a focus. I think we could see a lot of what we have been seeing with this administration and of the small yard, high fences type approach with respect to China continuing, but forging these into these new areas, like investment, like these bulk data EOs, just new spaces, but in an incremental way. I think we could see with a Trump 2 a much more, I would say, muscular unilateral approach when it comes to China and a lot of the areas that we've been talking about, with unpredictability on where deals may be struck. So there may be one direction taken with ultimately a deal being struck in a different one, especially when key US constituencies may be affected or harmed.
Great. Well, I realize we have just a couple of minutes left, and we do have to end on time for the happy hour. So I'm going to do a quick little lightning round here. And Nigel, let me start with you just for about, 30 seconds or 1 minute each. I think we all kind of have a vision of what the trajectory could be. Election may change that. We all have a vision of the trajectory. What's a curveball you are would advise people around the room to be thinking about that could hit them out of left field?
I think economic and national security as a paradigm is here to stay. The severity of those cuts, I think, could expand beyond where they've already gone in terms of AI, data, and digital connectivity, simply because of if you really want to go there, the concerns about operational control of key architecture and critical services. If you go down that road to the full extent that a national security official can, then it leads to essentially a non-China IT system of sorts. So that could be, we saw indicators of that in Trump 1.0, the clean network and all that sort of stuff.
Emily, lightning round for you. If you were advising the board or C-suite of one of these companies in the room today, what would you tell them to be hopeful about?
Well, there's actually an interesting piece in Inside US Trade from this afternoon that says that barriers to digital services trade have gone up about 25% over the last decade. However, the IMF says that growth in digital services trade has increased by over 8% for a total value of about 5 trillion with a T per year. And this is really emblematic of the idea that you can simultaneously pursue a de-risking and economic security agenda, a greater, more expansive national security toolkit, and still have trade growth. We are all assuming that this new paradigm is doom and gloom. It's actually completely possible that we retool supply chains, including digital and tangible supply chains, and that trade actually deepens. And that's just about going out, identifying new partnerships, finding new marketplaces. And I think the one potential curveball from your last question is that the timeline becomes too tight. That's the one thing that could imperil this agenda. But with sufficient time, I think we can absolutely still continue to have a very vibrant and mostly global digital economy.
And Neena, the last question for you. You obviously worked at when you were at Medtronic, truly global company, operating at 100+ markets, I'm sure easy. And you are now advising companies that are active all over the world. Talked a lot about the US, talked a little bit about China. What are the other regions that you think over the next, 12, 24 months, companies you are advising need to be thinking about this issue set?
Well, I think that the work that's happening in the EU is definitely something to keep an eye on. The EU has been really out in front on the digital services issues and data issues over the last several years. And in the intersection of trade and national security, I think the EU is kind of building the plane and flying it at the same time. In many ways, we see what's been happening with the build of the regime on Russia sanctions. We see what's been happening over the last few weeks on electric vehicles. I think that this is going to be an evolution, and these are rules that are going to be affecting so many companies that do have this global footprint, global footprints.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We are now at time. Please join me in thanking our panel. Really just terrific comments. Thank all of you.